All right, guys, so we're starting one of our final units here. This is Unit 8, and this unit covers international human rights crises. So, a lot of the things that we've talked about previously, a lot of the human rights violations, civil rights reform, and things like that, battles for equality and equity all over the United States. Now we're going to be looking at similar situations outside of our borders. We're going to be looking at countries like China, North Korea, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela. And today we're going to start with Rwanda, sort of going in chronological order. And this particular situation happened in the 90s. And it's a sort of like a good leeway into this basically new era that we're going to be covering. So a little background. I'm sure you learned about the Rwandan Civil War and the Rwandan genocide in your world history class. At least I hope you did. If you didn't, then this will be a good time to cover it. So some background. Going all the way back to like 1500 and and before 1500 AD, I should say, and before, when this area of land was really first settled, there are two racial groups in Rwanda: the Hutus and the Tutsis. So Hutu is spelled Hutu, and Tutsi is Tutsi. So these are two separate racial groups in Rwanda that originally settled this land. And there was at first more of a like class separation between the two, and that's what's going to continue as time goes on. The Hutus were more farmers, and the Tutsis were more into livestock, and like they herded cattle. As time went on and African kingdoms formed, the Tutsis became more dominant. And they held more power in the region of Rwanda. But as time went on, we know eventually Europe and the European powers will, the scramble for Africa, they will colonize almost every inch of it. And when that happened, France took over Rwanda, and they connected not with the Tutsis, who had become more dominant, but with the Hutus, and they gave them more power in the Rwandan government. So because of that, a lot of the Tutsis in Rwanda left, and then the ones who did not leave became a minority group that were very discriminated against. And there were some physical differences between the Hutus and the Tutsis, but for the most part, people who are not Rwandan would have a very difficult time telling the difference between, if not impossible time, telling the difference between a Hutu and a Tutsi. And as generations were born and more of those groups sort of melded together, and by the time we get to like 1994, when this situation occurs, it's virtually impossible even for the Rwandans to tell the difference between Hutus and Tutsi people. So, eventually we know that France pulled out of Africa and pulled out of Rwanda, and the Hutu-led government at that time, it sort of weakened them, and it allowed for this Tutsi group to form in defense, to try and take back some of their own power. And they were called the Tutsi Rwandan Patriotic Front, or the RPF. So what erupted in the 90s was a civil war now between the Hutus and the Tutsis. The Tutsis being the rebels and the Hutus being the government. And a majority of that rebel group, of course, being funded and pushed by the RPF. This was the worst of the genocide to take place through this entire civil war was during the summer of 1994. The Hutus killed between 500,000 and over 1 million Tutsi men, women, and children, which was 70% of the Tutsi population in Rwanda. We don't know the total numbers because so many people were buried in mass graves and things like that. Things finally did end when the Rwandan Patriotic Front won the civil war. The Tutsi side was victorious, and a lot of the Hutus actually fled Rwanda because of that into neighboring countries. And this opened up, there a lot of blame went around. Of course, Europe, what needed and was expected to take a certain amount of responsibility and involvement in this, as the power structure between the Hutus and the Tutsis was, um, a lot of that blame can be placed on the European colonization of all of Africa. Had the French not favored the Hutus and placed them in power and been so discriminatory against the Tutsis, then there might not have been a Tutsi rebellion of this magnitude. The UN and the US, though, in general, did not really intervene, and received a lot of criticism because of that. There were Americans in Rwanda at the time. There were Europeans in Rwanda. There were UN troops in Rwanda when this was going on. But they were never given the authorization to actually take military action to protect anyone, not necessarily to, attack any rebel forces or government groups, but they were never even told that they could fire a gun to save the life of a person. And so because of that, we see millions of people killed through this, and it has been a learning experience for everyone. And it's, there are still people who say, this had nothing to do with the United States. We never needed to get involved. But when you look back on other genocides like the Holocaust, with, today, so many people say, why didn't we get involved sooner? Why didn't someone stop this from happening sooner? But then, this situation, we see people are saying like, oh, well, we never should have gotten involved. And of course, there are racial undertones to all of those things, and all of those comments. But like I said, Bill Clinton, who was president at the time, ultimately decided to keep the United States out of it, and he definitely got a fair amount of criticism for it during his administration.